Hello, welcome to the second episode of the Tribune Digest. Today we're interviewing Aureo de Paula, professor in econometrics at the economics department. Professor de Paula's research focuses on applied econometrics combined with empirical microeconomics, and he is currently affiliated with several research groups across the world, including the IFS, the Center for Economic Policy Research here in the UK, and the specific paper we'll be discussing today was published in October of 2020, just before the beginning of the second COVID wave here in the UK, and it's entitled Preparing for a Pandemic, Spending Dynamics and Panic Buying During the First COVID-19 Wave. So just getting straight into the questions, just very big picture. The early days of the pandemic were, I think, for many of us, quite chaotic. We probably remember seeing pictures online of shoppers piling up rolls of toilet paper, canned foods, and other essentials. And some of us probably rushed to stores ourselves to stock on these goods, in spite of warnings regarding shortages from the authorities. So, Professor, what do you think people reacted in this way? And do you think they were wrong to do so?
First of all, thank you so much, Rasmus, for hosting this interview. So were people wrong to have rushed to the supermarket if they did so? Not really. In a moment of such heightened uncertainty, if you're at risk of running out of household supplies, some of which are quite essential for day-to-day life, or food, it's not at all, ill-advised or wrong for people to act on those impulses in order to avoid the unpleasant lack of toilet tissue or soap or food. So they weren't wrong. Of course, the crowds are not always wise. So if everybody does it at the same time, that may lead to outcomes in the aggregate that are not desirable. We see this in economics all the time, right? So in game theory, we typically talk about the prisoner's dilemma, where you end up with an outcome that's not the best for the two prisoners involved, and it's essentially due to the lack of coordination. So individually, no, they weren't wrong. As a whole, of course, that can lead to highly unpleasant situations.
Getting into some slightly more specific questions. So when did you start thinking about and researching this issue? When did you start researching this issue? Was it when the COVID pandemic hit? Was it when lockdown started to be rumored? Did you expect this to happen, these shortages?
Yeah, so since you alluded to Brexit, maybe, part of the genesis can be traced back to Brexit. There were already discussions on how Brexit would affect supply possibilities and demand. Do I need to stock up on French food or canned cassoulet and things along those lines? So in a certain way, myself and my co-authors already were monitoring the situation even before the pandemic became very salient here in the UK. So our formal exit of the European Union happened, not more or less at the same time, if you remember. And what we started doing, for example, we started monitoring supermarket websites for availability of items. So it's not something that's in the study, but we were already looking at it. And then when, of course, the pandemic hit and the news started broadcasting all these episodes of shortages, and you yourself might have gone to the supermarket and see some empty shelves, then we noticed that, wow, this is a very interesting thing to shed light on. And again, the reason why also I was monitoring the Brexit thing with this particular topic in mind is because I had done this study that I just briefly mentioned on the great rice crisis of 2008, and the theme stayed with me. So that's I guess a little bit of the personal history for the paper.
Mm-hmm. So if you could elaborate just a bit on how this type of data is collected, because I believe it's a bit different to what you would normally see?
Yeah, so
cases?
so these data, they come, I think presently they have something like a little bit more than 15,000 households. So they enlist these households into a panel. So these people are remunerated for that, as is the case with several other surveys of the same nature. And then what happens is that whenever they go to the grocery store or the off license on the corner, or even I don't know, a market like the Broadway market, or the borough market, and buy groceries, they need to scan or register whatever they bought that day. So you have a record of what you bought, when you bought it, and how much and what price you paid for that good. So typically this is done by, either recording it, I don't know, on the platform for the data collection, or using literally a scanner, where you, when you go through the checkout in the supermarket, you scan your barcode, and then it registers that. It would be the same thing here. So I also know where you bought it. So I can actually tell in this data the exact location of the supermarket you used to do that. And I do know some information about, of course, the panel participants as well. So these types of data are collected by Kantar and similar firms, and are used quite widely in the private sector by companies to look at marketing decisions and things of that sort, but also by scholars that want to investigate consumer behavior, demand, and marketing, for example. So in the US, there is a similar data set that's collected by Nielsen, for example. So people are very familiar with that. And then you can see this is the British version of those types of data.
So the fact that we experienced these shortages clearly show, as you said, that there was increased demand. But a key part of your paper is decomposing this increased demand into what you refer to as the extensive margin and the intensive margin, to study whether hoarding did cause shortages. So what does this mean, and how did you accomplish it? And what were the findings, obviously?
Yeah, this terminology, extensive and intensive, is something that it's a bit of a jargony terminology that you will see sometimes economists use. So you see that to a certain extent when economists are talking about labor supply. And in that context, the extensive margin would be, for example, do I work or do I not work? And the intensive margin is conditional on working. How many hours do I work? So the extensive and intensive terminology here is alluding to something similar. Is, do I buy or do I not buy this item? Or and the intensive margin is conditional on buying. How much do I buy of it? So do I buy or do I not buy toilet tissue? And conditioning on buying toilet tissue, am I buying much more than I usually do? So this is essentially two different margins of behavior that one can think of in analyzing this problem.
So what were your findings then? Which one was driving the shortages?
Yeah, so our findings are that the extensive margin was responsible, if I'm not mistaken, for about 70% of the increases that we see. And people, as I was mentioning before, weren't buying that much more when they bought. They were buying a little bit more. So what did happen was that at the same time, around March of 2020, people were in a more or less, certainly a simultaneous way, but uncoordinated, but coordinated in an uncoordinated manner, going to the shops and buying more of a lot of things, or buying a lot of things, not as much as they, or not much more than they would typically buy, but there was a concomitant and simultaneous trip to the supermarket to buy things when they, in normal circumstances, would not have bought it in such a coordinated or simultaneous manner.
So it was driven by many people buying just a bit more often.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And so you mentioned working from home, but obviously during the pandemic, there was quite a big concern about some people, essential workers, still having to work outside the home and some working from home, usually those of a bit higher income. So did you find differences in different socioeconomic groups with regard to their change in consumption?
Yeah, so, and this actually is not dissimilar from what I find in the paper on the rice crisis, for example. Is what we do find is that wealthier households tended to increase their expenditures more than less wealthy households. So again, this jives with this idea that probably those individuals were the ones that were actually consuming more at home, but also the ones that were more able to perhaps stock up, if you will, than the less wealthy households.
Mm-hmm. Right. And as you mentioned at the beginning, some stores eventually did start to limit quantities that customers could buy to address these shortages, which for most of us, I don't think we had ever experienced in our lives before. So you tried to simulate the impact that these strategies would have had in this period. And what did you find then?
We found that it didn't make much of a difference. Because people, again, weren't buying that much more than they usually would. So if I'm not mistaken, so if you limited purchases to the numbers that you would see in the news, so I guess, you can only buy up to these many rolls of toilet tissue and so on and so forth, you would have perhaps, a 10 percentage point decrease in the demand, but that was not nearly as high as the increase that you would still be left over, which was above 30%. So it wouldn't be as effective. And again, doing this wouldn't preclude people from changing their shopping behavior somehow. And this is something that we don't get into because, again, we're just doing more descriptive analysis. So if you're only allowing me to buy 2 rolls of, toilet tissue, I'll buy 2 rolls in Sainsbury's, then I'm going to buy 2 other rolls in Tesco's, and, I'll end up stocking up in the same manner. So,
right. So obviously this doesn't really prevent the issue. So then any other policies you found could have been effective or should be implemented in the future? Should the same thing happen again?
Yeah, so when you think about these types of episodes, the couple of things may come to mind more or less immediately. Of course, one would be some sort of quota or rationing. Of course, this has all sorts of complicated repercussions. Not only it may be difficult to implement for reasons that I mentioned before, but even if it's implemented at a broader, more holistic level, it doesn't come without problems as well. So you did have, say, rationing in the UK right after the Second World War, for example. People had a rationing card, for example, and you couldn't buy more than this much. Again, this introduces all sorts of different inefficiencies. And while it may be necessary to pursue something like that in certain circumstances, it's probably not the most advisable thing. Allowing firms to increase prices, of course, may attenuate demand, but won't come without repercussions for welfare. Things are more expensive. I mean, prices are increasing right now, and that's not a source of joy for most of us. And of course, at the same time, controlling prices is not a solution either. If anything, it exacerbates the problem. So that's another type of thing to control. If firms all of a sudden try to increase prices to counter this issue. So I grew up in Brazil in a period of very high inflation. And I remember when I was about a little bit more than 10 years old, one of the ways in which the government tried to combat inflation was, prices are frozen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can't increase prices. So what did happen is that then you had lots of shortages, because I mean, if I am growing cattle, I'm not gonna, send it to the supermarket because I'm not gonna get as much. So you start having all sorts of shortages. So these types of government controls, they have all sorts of unintended repercussions. So if I'm trying to do rationing, I may create a black market. Right. Black market for toilet tissue. Who knows? That might happen. Now, what we envision as potential solutions for it are certainly, the less wealthy households in this study and other studies that I've seen are the ones that are more affected possibly by these shortages. So a policy that targeted those particular households would definitely be welcome. The question is, what policy do we do? And I wouldn't have an answer for you on that.
So do you think consumers should also be involved? Should we ourselves have a stock of necessities just in case COVID 2022 happens?
No, I would not advocate that you start stockpiling everything that you consume in ways that you're typically not used to. Of course, if these measures were in place, there would be no need for you to preemptively do it. Of course, every individual faces different degrees of uncertainty in his or her life that has to do with their particular circumstances, and part of it is going to be an economy-wide thing, and one should act in accordance to how risk-averse he or she is, and to the perceived risks that he or she has. But again, a concerted policy to coordinate again and streamline and make, say, supply chains more resilient, plus preemptive measures or policies that will act much like a deposit guarantee type thing, will do already a lot to attenuate many of the fears and the perceived risks that people have. So you wouldn't need to stock up. Just like I don't need to put money in my mattress.
Yeah, of course.
For fear that my bank, which I'm not going to name, is going to go bankrupt.
So are you aware of this sort of measure being implemented anywhere as of now?
No, I'm not. So this is just a wild speculation. Who knows? So if you ever see a toilet tissue bank taking shape, you heard it here first.
Great. So you mentioned before how you would like to extend the study once the pandemic is starting to recede to see if patterns have changed. But are there other issues on this topic which you think the pandemic will have changed completely, in which you would like to see more research in the future?
Yeah, so I would be very interested in seeing how not only the consumers will have changed their behavior, but also how the retailers and manufacturers will have changed, say, their pricing protocols. So this goes back, once again, I keep referring to that other study, the RISE study. So what did happen, so there we're using data from the United States that's somewhat similar to what we have here. And in fact, there we actually do have data on how much each one of these stores sells per week, say. And what happened was that prices started increasing as people were buying more and more rice. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they went up to about 15 to 20% of the price that was in place right before, this crisis began, and they stay there. So they reached a new level and then they stay there. And I suspect that part of it has to do with, again, how firms were pricing and how they were perceiving their competitors to be pricing. And so you reach a new sticking point in that respect. So the other thing that does happen too, and I didn't mention this, is that typically, so if you go to a big supermarket chain, the prices will tend to be uniform across the whole country. So if you go to Tesco here near UCL, you're going to be paying, I'm pretty confident, the same price that you would be paying in Liverpool for a particular good. And a lot of the price fluctuations that you see are actually in promotions.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that did happen during the pandemic is that the frequency of promotions decreased. Mm-hmm. So you also had an increase in prices, which now is more accentuated. So again, this is another dimension that I would like to see, and it's connected to this pricing, phenomenon that I mentioned before. What happens before and after the pandemic, and the frequency and the way in which your retailer is going to be putting goods on sale.
Well, thank you so much for the insight, Professor. I hopefully will have motivated someone to start a toilet tissue bank somewhere out there in the future.
Thank you very much, Rasmus.
Thank you so much for this episode.